In the bustling streets of ancient Rome, amidst the grandeur of marble columns and sprawling villas, a hidden workforce toiled tirelessly, shaping the very foundations of one of history's greatest empires. These were the slaves of Rome, a diverse group whose lives and labor were as varied as the empire itself. As the philosopher Seneca poignantly observed in his Moral Letters to Lucilius, "Kindly remember that he whom you call your slave sprang from the same stock, is smiled upon by the same skies, and on equal terms with yourself breathes, lives, and dies." At the heart of Roman households, the servi domestici, or household slaves, formed an integral part of daily life. In 79 CE, when Mount Vesuvius erupted, burying Pompeii in ash, it preserved a snapshot of Roman domestic life. Archaeologists have uncovered evidence of these household slaves, from the kitchen implements they used to the small, cramped quarters where they slept. In the grand villa of Julia Felix, inscriptions reveal the names of her personal attendants: Successus, her butler, and Capella, her hairdresser. These slaves were often highly skilled and educated, some even serving as tutors to their master's children. The famous grammarian Remius Palamon, who taught in Rome during the reigns of Tiberius and Claudius, was himself a former slave who had been educated alongside his master's son. Cicero's relationship with his slave, Tiro, exemplifies the complex dynamics between masters and their more trusted servants. Tiro, who served as Cicero's secretary and confidant, was so valued that Cicero wrote in a letter to his brother Quintus, "I have no one with whom to talk, in whom I can take any pleasure. Tiro is not with me." Tiro eventually earned his freedom and went on to publish Cicero's works, preserving them for posterity. He also invented a system of shorthand known as Tironian notes. Another notable example is Epictetus, born a slave in Hierapolis around 50 CE, who later became one of the most influential Stoic philosophers after gaining his freedom. Beyond the city walls, under the scorching Italian sun, agricultural slaves labored on vast estates known as latifundia. These sprawling farms, some covering thousands of acres, were the backbone of Rome's agricultural economy. Cato the Elder, in his work De Agricultura, provides a glimpse into the harsh life of these slaves, recommending that a farm of 240 iugera, about 150 acres, should be worked by 16 slaves. He advises owners to sell old or sickly slaves, treating them as disposable tools rather than human beings. A stark example of this mentality comes from Vettius Pollio, a wealthy Roman equestrian who was known to feed disobedient slaves to his lampreys. When Emperor Augustus dined with him, he was so appalled by this practice that he ordered all of Pollio's valuable drinking vessels to be smashed and his fish pond to be filled in. The latifundia system, which reached its peak in the 1st century CE, was so extensive that Pliny the Elder lamented in his Natural History. Largest estates have been the ruin of Italy and are now ruining the provinces as well. These vast farms, worked by countless unnamed slaves, produced the grain, olive oil, and wine that fed the empire. The scale of this agricultural slavery was immense. For instance, the Roman senator Pedanius Secundus, murdered by one of his slaves, owned over 400 slaves just in his urban household. This incident led to a contentious debate in the Senate about executing all of Pedanius's household slaves, as was customary under Roman law. In stark contrast to the anonymous toil of agricultural slaves, gladiators lived lives of danger and occasionally glory. The gladiatorial schools, like the famous Ludus Magnus in Rome, trained slaves to become warriors for public entertainment. The life of a gladiator was brutal, but could offer a path to fame and even freedom. Spartacus, perhaps the most famous gladiator in history, led a slave rebellion that shook the foundations of the Roman Republic. Although ultimately defeated, his story inspired generations and highlighted the potential power of the enslaved masses. The rebellion, known as the Third Servile War, lasted for 2 years and at its height involved an estimated 120,000 escaped slaves and free poor. Plutarch recounts that when Spartacus was finally cornered by Marcus Licinius Crassus's forces, he dramatically killed his horse before the final battle, declaring, "If I am victorious, I shall have horses in abundance. If I am defeated, I shall have no need of them." While gladiators faced death in the arena, mining and quarry slaves confronted it daily in the dark depths of the earth. In the gold mines of Las Medulas in northwestern Spain, thousands of slaves worked in treacherous conditions. Pliny the Elder described the process of hydraulic mining used there, where slaves would dig tunnels into hillsides before releasing massive amounts of water to erode the rock and reveal gold deposits. The mortality rate was staggering. Many slaves survived only a few months in these conditions. Yet, their labor was crucial to Rome's economy, with Las Medulas alone producing an estimated 1.6 million kelgies of gold over 2 centuries. The Greek geographer Strabo noted that the death toll in these mines exceeded that of the wars that had initially conquered the region. These slaves endured incredible hardships, for they not only work continuously under the earth, digging passages and galleries, but they do so in shifts day and night. Many of these unfortunate souls never saw the light of day again, perishing in the dark, damp tunnels, their bodies often left where they fell. The Roman naturalist Pliny the Elder, in his Natural History, recounted how slaves in the gold mines of northwest Hispania would tunnel through mountains by the light of lamps, the duration of which forms the measure of the shifts. For months, the miners do not see the light of day. In the marble quarries of Carrara, slaves extracted the gleaming white stone that would adorn Rome's grandest buildings. The historian Strabo noted the difficulty of this work, describing how large marble blocks were transported down steep mountain slopes using specialized wooden sledges. The slaves who performed this dangerous task lived short, brutal lives, their names lost to history even as their work continues to inspire awe in structures like the Pantheon. An inscription found near the quarries, dating to the 2nd century CE, mentions a slave named Phoebus who died at the age of 20, crushed by a falling block of marble. Such tragedies were commonplace, yet the demand for marble never ceased. Emperor Augustus famously boasted, "I found Rome a city of bricks and left it a city of marble." Amidst this sea of private slavery, a unique category emerged, the servi publici, or public slaves. These individuals, owned by the state rather than private citizens, often enjoyed better conditions than their privately owned counterparts. In Rome, public slaves maintained temples, assisted in administrative tasks, and even helped manage the complex water system that fed the city's famous fountains and baths. An inscription from 123 CE mentions a public slave named Narcissus, who served as a clerk in the office of the water commissioner, demonstrating the responsible positions these slaves could hold. The Vestal Virgins, Rome's revered priestesses, were each allocated 2 public slaves to assist them in their sacred duties. These slaves, unlike most others, were allowed to wear the pileus, a felt cap that symbolized freedom, indicating their elevated status. The lives of Roman slaves were as diverse as they were difficult. From the educated household slave managing his master's affairs to the nameless miners toiling in Spain's gold mines, each played a crucial role in building and maintaining the vast Roman Empire. Their stories, often overlooked in grand historical narratives, form the foundation upon which Rome's legacy was built, a legacy that continues to fascinate and influence our world today. As the satirist Juvenal astutely observed in his Satires, What can you do when a man loses all sense of shame? When he puts on the mask of a slave dealer and isn't embarrassed to sell his own friends? The human bazaar. Rome's insatiable appetite for slaves. In the heart of the Roman Forum, amidst the clamor of merchants and the rustle of toga, stands a stark reminder of the empire's dark underbelly: the slave market. Here, human lives were commodities, bought and sold with the same nonchalance as olives or wine. The air was thick with the mingled scents of exotic spices and human despair, a pungent metaphor for the vast and complex network of the Roman slave trade. As Rome's borders expanded, so too did its hunger for slaves. The conquest of Carthage in 146 BCE flooded the markets with an estimated 50,000 new slaves, while Julius Caesar's campaigns in Gaul from 5850 BCE resulted in the enslavement of nearly 1 million Gallic people. The Greek historian Polybius described the aftermath of the Roman sack of Corinth. "I saw with my own eyes pictures thrown to the ground, and soldiers using them as gaming boards. These treasured artworks lay discarded while their former owners were bound in chains, destined for the slave markets of Rome." The Roman general Mummius, who led the sack of Corinth, was so ignorant of the value of the art he plundered that he warned the ship captains transporting the loot to Rome that they would have to replace any lost pieces with new ones. The scale of Rome's slave acquisition through conquest was staggering. Following the Third Macedonian War, the Roman general Aemilius Paulus oversaw the enslavement of 150,000 epirotes. This mass enslavement was so efficient that the Greek historian Plutarch later wrote, "It took only 1 hour for 70 cities to be plundered and their inhabitants enslaved." In 107 BCE, the Roman general Gaius Marius defeated the Teutones and Ambrones at the Battle of Aquae Sextiae, capturing 80,000 prisoners who were subsequently sold into slavery. The Roman historian Livy recounts that after the fall of New Carthage, Scipio Africanus personally supervised the division of captives, separating the citizens who would be ransomed from the artisans who were to become public slaves of Rome. Yet, conquest was not the only source of slaves. Piracy, particularly in the Mediterranean, played a significant role. The island of Delos, a major slave trading hub, saw up to 10,000 slaves change hands daily at its peak in the 2nd century BCE. The Roman orator Cicero, in his speech against Verres, recounted how the corrupt governor of Sicily colluded with pirates, allowing them to raid coastal towns and sell the captured inhabitants into slavery. One particularly notorious incident involved the young Julius Caesar, who was kidnapped by Cilician pirates. During his captivity, Caesar joked that he would return and crucify them all, a promise he later fulfilled after his ransom was paid, and he was released. Professional slave traders, known as mangones, operated throughout the empire, sourcing slaves from various regions and transporting them to bustling markets. These traders were known for their cunning and often unscrupulous methods. The Roman agricultural writer Varro, in his work on agriculture, advised potential buyers to be wary of traders who smear the bodies of slaves with ointments to make them appear of better condition. Some traders went as far as to dye the hair of older slaves or apply makeup to hide blemishes. One of the most infamous slave dealers was a man named Tunnus, who once sold 2 boys to Mark Antony, claiming they were twins to increase their value. When Antony discovered the deception, the boys spoke different languages and were clearly not related. He demanded an explanation. Tunnus audaciously claimed that this very difference made them more valuable, impressing Antony with his quick wit. The economy of the Roman Empire was deeply intertwined with the slave trade. In the 1st century CE, it's estimated that slaves made up 30 to 40% of Italy's population, with Rome itself potentially housing up to 400,000 slaves. The trade was so lucrative that Emperor Augustus imposed a 4% tax on slave sales, demonstrating both the scale and the state's reliance on this human commerce. This tax, known as the Quadragesima Mancipiorum, brought significant revenue to the imperial treasury. Slave markets were a common sight in Roman cities. The largest in Rome was located near the Temple of Castor, where slaves stood on revolving platforms, their feet chalked white to denote their status. Each wore a placard detailing their origins, skills, and any defects, as mandated by the curule aediles, who regulated the markets. The Roman playwright Plautus, in his comedy Persa, satirized these practices, depicting a character who attempts to sell his daughter as an exotic slave, boasting of her non-existent musical talents. In reality, skilled slaves were highly valued. The physician Galen, writing in the 2nd century CE, mentions a slave doctor being sold for 60,000 sesterces, a testament to the premium placed on specialized knowledge. The process of sale was often degrading and thorough. Potential buyers could inspect slaves as if they were livestock, checking their teeth, muscles, and even their bodily features. Galen, writing in the 2nd century CE, described how some buyers would stroke the bodies of boys and girls to judge their physical condition. Slaves with special skills or beauty could command high prices. The grammarian Lucius Daphnis, for instance, was sold for 700,000 sesterces, a sum equivalent to the annual pay of 700 legionaries. The orator and teacher Quintilian, in his Institutio Oratoria, advised that a well-educated slave could be worth 100,000 sesterces or more, underscoring the value placed on intellectual abilities. Private auctions were held for high-value slaves, often those with specialized skills or exceptional beauty. The poet Martial, in one of his epigrams, describes a beautiful slave girl named Eros being auctioned. 100 hands were raised to bid. The auctioneer could scarcely keep track. These auctions could be highly competitive. Suetonius recounts that Emperor Augustus once paid 200,000 sesterces for a slave cook, an astronomical sum that reflected both the emperor's wealth and the value placed on culinary skill in Roman high society. As the sun sets over the forum, casting long shadows across the slave market, the day's transactions come to an end. Tomorrow, new ships will dock at Ostia, bringing fresh cargo from distant lands. The human bazaar of Rome never truly closes, for the empire's appetite for slaves is as vast and unending as its ambitions of conquest. In the words of the satirist Juvenal, writing in the early 2nd century CE, "There's nothing that a man won't believe if he's afraid, nothing he won't endure if he's greedy." And in the slave markets of Rome, both fear and greed reigned supreme, a testament to the complex and often cruel society that built one of history's greatest empires on the backs of countless enslaved souls. Shackled souls, the brutal reality of Roman slave life. In the shadow of Rome's grandeur, beneath the marble columns and gilded temples, lay a world of unimaginable suffering. The lives of Roman slaves were etched with pain, their days a relentless march of toil and torment. From the crack of dawn to the fall of night, these human chattel existed in a realm where their very humanity was denied, their bodies and minds mere possessions to be used and abused at their master's whims. As the philosopher Seneca poignantly observed in his Moral Essays, "Slavery is the death of the soul." As the first light of day crept over the 7 hills, slaves across the empire stirred from their meager sleeping quarters. In the vast latifundia of rural Italy, hundreds of agricultural slaves, their ankles often chained, shuffled out to the fields. Cato the Elder, in his work De Agricultura, advised landowners to keep their slaves constantly occupied, writing, "Men who are busy in labor are not busy in mischief. This cruel philosophy meant that field slaves could work up to 16 hours a day under the scorching Mediterranean sun, their backs bent double as they tended to crops or pruned vines. In the sprawling vineyards of Campania, slaves would rise before dawn to begin the back-breaking work of tending to the vines that produced the prized Falernian wine. The agronomist Columella recommended that vineyard slaves be tattooed on the forehead to prevent escape, a practice that literally branded these individuals as property. Urban slaves, while spared the back-breaking labor of the fields and mines, faced their own set of challenges. Domestic slaves in wealthy households could number in the hundreds, each with a specific task, from the villicus, house steward, to the lowest kitchen drudge. Their days were an endless cycle of service. The Roman poet Juvenal, in his third satire, paints a vivid picture of a rich man's entourage. At his side walks a whole regiment of retainers. There you may see the steward of his Gallic estates, here the bailiff of his Moorish property. There is no end to the tale of attendants. These slaves lived under constant scrutiny, their every action subject to their master's approval or displeasure. In the household of Emperor Claudius, a freedman named Pallas rose to such prominence that he was awarded the Hasta Pura, a military decoration, despite never having served in the army. Yet, even such favored individuals could fall from grace swiftly. The historian Suetonius recounts how Claudius had one of his favorite freedmen executed for adultery with Roman matrons. Physical abuse was a daily reality for many slaves. The Roman jurist Gaius, in his Institutes, stated matter-of-factly, "We may note that it is permissible for masters to deal with their slaves as they please." This carte blanche for cruelty led to horrific abuses. Flogging was so common that the whip became a symbol of the slave owner's authority. The playwright Plautus, in one of his comedies, has a character threaten a slave. "I'll make your back redder than your hair with my whip." More severe punishments awaited slaves who displeased their masters or attempted to escape. The historian Tacitus recounts how, following the murder of the city prefect Pedanius Secundus by one of his slaves, all 400 of the household slaves were executed despite public protests. This incident highlights the brutal application of the Senatus Consultum Silanianum, a decree that mandated the execution of all slaves in a household where a master was murdered. The philosopher Seneca, in a letter to Lucilius, describes witnessing the aftermath of such a mass execution. "Recently, in a morning spectacle, I saw a pair of victims thrown to the beasts. The crowd demands that the victims be brought back into the center to receive fresh wounds." The legal status of slaves in Roman society was unambiguous and harsh. As the jurist Ulpian declared in the early 3rd century CE, "Servil caput nullum ius habet." The slave has no legal standing. This meant that slaves could not legally marry, own property, or testify in court except under torture. The offspring of female slaves automatically became the property of their mother's owner, regardless of the father's status. This legal non-personhood was so ingrained that even if a slave was freed, they still owed a debt of obligation, obsequium, to their former master. Perhaps the most insidious aspect of Roman slavery was the exploitation of slaves, particularly women. Masters had complete control over their slaves, a fact reflected in the common Latin phrases "ancilla domini," maid of the master, and "puer delicatus," delicate boy, which were often euphemisms for personal servants. The poet Horace, in his satires, casually mentions using slave girls for gratification as a normal part of life. This mistreatment was so normalized that it was rarely commented upon, except when it interfered with the slave's other duties. The case of Antonia Minor, mother of Emperor Claudius, illustrates the extent of this exploitation. Suetonius reports that she had her secretary, Pallas, crucified for refusing her advances, a chilling reminder of the absolute power masters held over their slaves. Punishment for slaves could be creative in its cruelty. The columbarium, a form of confinement in small, dark spaces, was used to break a slave's will. Some unfortunate slaves were condemned ad bestias, thrown to wild beasts in the arena for public entertainment. The most feared punishment was crucifixion, reserved for the most serious offenses like rebellion. Yet, even in this ocean of misery, there were islands of relative comfort. Some skilled slaves, like doctors, teachers, or accountants, could live comparatively well, even accumulating savings, peculium, that could eventually buy their freedom. Chains of Defiance, the untold saga of Rome's slave rebellions. In the annals of Roman history, few tales are as harrowing and inspiring as those of the slave revolts that shook the very foundations of the empire. These uprisings, born from the depths of human suffering and the unquenchable thirst for freedom, left an indelible mark on the ancient world, forcing Rome to confront the brutal realities of its slave-driven society. The most famous of these rebellions, the Third Servile War, led by the indomitable Spartacus, erupted in 73 BCE like a long dormant volcano. Spartacus, a Thracian gladiator enslaved by Rome, broke free from a ludus in Capua along with 70 fellow gladiators. Among his co-conspirators were Crixus, a Gallic warrior, and Venemaus, a skilled gladiator from Gaul. Armed with little more than kitchen utensils and an unbreakable will, they overcame their guards and escaped into the countryside. Their first target was Mount Vesuvius, where they established a temporary stronghold. Little did Rome know that this small band of fugitives would soon grow into an army that would strike terror into the heart of the mightiest empire on earth. As word spread of Spartacus's escape, slaves from across Italy flocked to his banner. The rebel army swelled to tens of thousands, a motley crew of gladiators, field hands, and domestic servants united by their shared dream of freedom. They moved swiftly, outmaneuvering the hastily assembled Roman forces sent to quell what was initially dismissed as a minor disturbance. Plutarch recounts how Spartacus, in a display of tactical brilliance, used vines to rappel down the steep slopes of Mount Vesuvius, surprising and routing the Roman forces that had thought them trapped. This victory against the praetor Claudius Glaber was a pivotal moment, demonstrating that slave rebels could defeat professional Roman troops. Victory after victory followed. At Thurii in southern Italy, Spartacus defeated the praetor Gaius Claudius Glaber. Near Picenum in central Italy, he crushed the forces of Publius Varinius. The Roman historian Appian tells us that Spartacus even captured Varinius's horse, a humiliating blow to Roman pride. With each triumph, more slaves joined the rebellion, and even some free men, drawn by Spartacus's charisma and the promise of plunder, threw in their lot with the rebels. At its height, Spartacus's army may have numbered as many as 120,000 fighters. They ranged across Italy, from Campania in the south to Mutina, modern Modena, in the north, leaving a trail of destroyed latifundia, large slave-worked estates, in their wake. But the winds of fortune are fickle, and Rome was not to be so easily toppled. In 71 BCE, the Senate entrusted Marcus Licinius Crassus, one of Rome's wealthiest and most ambitious men, with the task of crushing the rebellion. Crassus raised a massive army of 8 legions and pursued Spartacus relentlessly. He revived the ancient punishment of decimation, executing 1 in every 10 of his own men to instill iron discipline. After early defeats, the final battle took place near the Sila River in southern Italy. There, Spartacus made his last stand. Appian tells us that before the battle, Spartacus dramatically killed his horse, declaring, "If I am victorious, I shall have many better horses. If I am defeated, I shall have no need of this one." This act, reminiscent of ancient heroes, underscored the epic nature of the conflict. The battle was a slaughter. Spartacus fought his way through the Roman lines, intent on engaging Crassus in single combat, but fell before he could reach him. Plutarch writes that Spartacus was wounded in the thigh by a pilum javelin, but continued fighting on his knees, wielding his sword. His army was annihilated, with survivors ruthlessly hunted down. In a final act of brutal repression, Crassus crucified 6,000 captured rebels along the Appian Way, from Capua to Rome, a forest of crosses stretching for 120 miles, a grim reminder of the price of rebellion. The Roman poet Horace, writing decades later, referred to this gruesome spectacle in his Epodes. The very birds of prey shrink back in horror from such a feast. Yet, the Third Servile War was but the crescendo in a long symphony of slave resistance. 4 decades earlier, Sicily had been rocked by 2 massive slave revolts that foreshadowed the havoc Spartacus would wreak. The First Servile War began when a Syrian slave named Eunice, claiming divine inspiration, led a rebellion that quickly engulfed the island. Eunice, who could reportedly breathe fire and prophesy the future, was proclaimed king by his followers, taking the royal name Antiochus. His army, which grew to 200,000 strong, captured the city of Enna and defeated several Roman forces sent against them. The rebellion spread like wildfire, with another slave leader, Cleon, capturing Agrigentum and joining forces with Eunice. For 3 years, they held large swaths of Sicily, establishing a slave kingdom that minted its own coins. These coins, some of which have been found by archaeologists, bore the inscription King Antiochus, a bold claim to legitimacy. It took the arrival of a large consular army under Publius Rupilius to finally crush the revolt. Eunice was captured and died in prison, reportedly eaten alive by lice, while thousands of his followers were crucified. The brutality of Rome's response was captured by the Greek historian Diodorus Siculus, who wrote, "The whole of Sicily was filled with corpses of slaves who had been crucified." Barely a generation later, Sicily erupted again. The Second Servile War was led by Salvius, who took the royal name Tryphon, and Athenion, a Cilician with a reputation for astrology. Once again, the rebels captured cities, defeated Roman armies, and established control over much of the island. The Roman historian Diodorus Siculus writes that the rebels ravaged the country without hindrance and plundered the estates of the Romans. Salvius even established a royal court at Triocala, complete with a council and bodyguards, mimicking the trappings of Hellenistic monarchy. It took 4 years and the personal intervention of the consul Manius Aquilius to finally quell the uprising. Aquilius resorted to poisoning water sources used by the rebels, an early form of chemical warfare that demonstrated Rome's desperation to end the revolt. These large-scale revolts were the most visible manifestations of slave resistance, but they were far from the only ones. Across the empire, slaves engaged in countless acts of smaller-scale defiance. In households, slaves might sabotage their master's possessions, work slowly or poorly, or steal food and valuables. The Roman agricultural writer Columella, in his work De Re Rustica, advises landowners to closely supervise their slaves, noting, "The slave should be visited frequently by the master, for then they will be more careful and attentive to their duties." This constant need for supervision speaks to the ongoing resistance of slaves to their condition. Some attempted escape, like Androcles, whose story is recounted by Aulus Gellius in his Noctes Attici. After fleeing his master in Africa, Androcles lived in a cave for 3 years, befriending a lion by removing a thorn from its paw. When later captured and condemned to be eaten by beasts in the arena, he was saved when the same lion recognized him and refused to attack. This tale, whether true or apocryphal, reflects the Roman fascination with stories of slave resistance and the complex relationship between masters and slaves. Other forms of resistance were more subtle. Slaves in urban households might spread gossip about their masters, undermining their reputation. Some, like the slave Sporus, who was castrated and married by Emperor Nero, found ways to exert influence over their masters. After Nero's death, Sporus became the companion of 3 subsequent emperors, demonstrating the complex power dynamics at play, even within the institution of slavery. From chains to chances, the bittersweet journey of Rome's freedmen. In the sprawling tapestry of Roman society, few threads were as complex and intricately woven as those of the freedmen and freedwomen. These former slaves, known as liberty, occupied a unique and often precarious position, straddling the worlds of servitude and freedom. Their stories, ranging from rags to riches tales to heartbreaking struggles, offer a fascinating glimpse into the social dynamics of ancient Rome and the enduring human spirit's quest for dignity and self-determination. The path to freedom for a Roman slave was known as manumission, a process as varied as it was transformative. Some slaves earned their freedom through years of loyal service, while others managed to save enough money to purchase their liberty. The formal act of manumission often took place before a magistrate, a solemn ceremony that marked the transition from property to person. In 19 BCE, during the reign of Augustus, the Lex Alia Sentia was passed, establishing stricter regulations for manumission, including a minimum age of 30 for the slave and 20 for the master. This law also stipulated that slaves who had been punished for serious crimes could only be freed to the status of dedicatai, a lower form of freedom without citizenship rights. One of the most common methods of manumission was through a master's will. The Roman statesman Pliny the Younger, writing in the late 1st century CE, mentions in his letters freeing several slaves upon his death, stating, "I have granted freedom to those slaves whom I considered worthy." This practice was so widespread that Augustus had to limit the number of slaves that could be freed in a will to prevent mass manumissions that might flood Roman society with new citizens. The Lex Fufia Canina of 2 BCE restricted the proportion of slaves that could be freed in a will, ranging from half for small slaveholders to a maximum of 100 for those with over 500 slaves. Once freed, these former slaves entered a world of newfound opportunities, but also lingering obligations. They often took the name of their former master, adding to it their own personal name. The relationship between freedmen and their former masters, now called patrons, was governed by the concept of obsequium, a set of duties and obligations. Freedmen were expected to show respect and provide services to their patrons, who in turn offered protection and support. This reciprocal relationship could be beneficial, but it also meant that true independence remained elusive for many. Liberty. The Roman jurist Ulpian emphasized the importance of this relationship. A freedman should always remember the benefit he has received and not refuse to perform his duties. Despite these constraints, some freedmen managed to carve out remarkable lives for themselves. Perhaps the most famous, albeit fictional, example is Trimalchio, the ostentatious host in Petronius's Satyricon, written in the 1st century CE. This satirical work presents Trimalchio as a former slave who has amassed enormous wealth and delights in showing it off at elaborate dinner parties. While exaggerated for comic effect, Trimalchio represents a very real phenomenon of social mobility among freedmen. His boastful claim, "I once was a frog, and now I'm a king," encapsulates the aspirations and sometimes gaudy displays of nouveau riche freedmen. Real-life success stories were not uncommon. Gaius Julius Hyginus, born a slave in Spain or Alexandria around 64 BCE, was freed by Augustus and went on to become the head of the Palatine Library, and a renowned writer on mythology, astronomy, and agriculture. His works, such as Fabulae and De Astronomia, became standard reference texts for centuries. Another notable freedman was Marcus Antonius Pallas, who rose to become a powerful imperial secretary under Claudius in the 1st century CE. Pliny the Elder noted that Pallas amassed a fortune of 300 million sesterces, an astronomical sum for the time. The Roman historian Tacitus, however, viewed Pallas's influence with disdain, writing in his Annals that the freedman was armed with boundless power. The world of business and commerce offered particularly fertile ground for ambitious freedmen. Many had developed valuable skills during their enslavement, whether in crafts, trade, or administration. The bustling port city of Ostia, Rome's gateway to the Mediterranean, was a hotbed of freedmen activity. Inscriptions found there reveal freedmen who became successful merchants, ship owners, and even religious officials in the imperial cult. One such example is Lucius Caecilius Jucundus, a freedman banker from Pompeii, whose wax tablets, preserved by the eruption of Vesuvius, provide invaluable insights into the financial dealings of the time. However, for every success story, countless others faced ongoing struggles and discrimination. Freedmen were barred from holding political office, joining the army, or marrying into the senatorial class. The Roman poet Horace, himself the son of a freedman, faced social snobbery despite his talent and connection. In his Satires, he recounts being mocked as a freedman's son by those who looked down on his origins. Horace's famous line, "Virtus libertasque paribus hominibus sunt omnia," "Virtue and liberty are all things to equal men," can be seen as a defiant response to such prejudice. The stigma of having once been a slave often clung not just to freedmen, but to their descendants as well. It typically took 3 generations for a family to fully shake off the taint of servile origins. This lingering prejudice is reflected in a quote attributed to the Emperor Claudius, who reportedly said, "Once a freedman, always a freedman." The Emperor Nero, despite his many faults, took steps to protect freedmen, passing laws that made it more difficult for patrons to revoke freedom once granted. Yet, despite these challenges, the institution of manumission and the presence of freedmen in Roman society represented a degree of social mobility that was rare in the ancient world. The Greek historian Dionysius of Halicarnassus marveled at the Roman practice of integrating former slaves into the citizenry, calling it an admirable custom, which has been the cause of their growth from a small and contemptible people to an extremely great and powerful nation. Some freedmen found innovative ways to navigate the social and legal constraints placed upon them. Unable to enter politics directly, they often exercised influence through their patrons or by joining influential professional guilds known as collegia. The tombstone of one Lucius Aurelius Hermia, a freedman butcher in Ostia, proudly proclaims his membership in the Butcher Guild and his role as an Augustules, a prestigious religious position often held by wealthy freedmen. These collegia not only provided economic support, but also a sense of community and dignity. The stories of individual freedmen and freedwomen provide vivid glimpses into the complexities of Roman social life. Consider Epictetus, born a slave in Hierapolis around 50 CE, who went on to become one of the most renowned Stoic philosophers of his time. Despite achieving freedom and fame, Epictetus chose to live simply, embodying the Stoic principles he taught. His teachings, recorded by his student Arrian, continue to inspire readers today with their emphasis on personal ethics and the pursuit of virtue, regardless of one's circumstances. Epictetus's famous quote, "No man is free who is not master of himself," encapsulates his philosophy and resonates with the experiences of many freedmen. Another poignant tale is that of Antonia Canis, a freedwoman who became the longtime companion of the future emperor Vespasian. Despite her lowly origin, Canis was known for her sharp mind and excellent memory. The historian Suetonius reports that she amassed considerable wealth and influence, often interceding in state affairs on behalf of petitioners. Her relationship with Vespasian lasted decades, and though they could not legally marry due to her status, he treated her as his wife in all but name. After her death, Vespasian continued to honor her memory, a testament to the deep bonds that could form across social boundaries. As we bid farewell to this chapter of history, let us remember the words of Marcus Tullius Cicero, the great Roman orator and statesman, who in 44 BCE wrote in his treatise De Officiis, "For those who say that we should respect our fellow citizens, but not foreigners, destroy the universal brotherhood of mankind. And when this is destroyed, kindness, generosity, goodness, and justice are all destroyed along with it." As the sun sets on the 7 hills of Rome, we leave behind the whispers of countless untold stories, of slaves who dreamed, freedmen who strived, and a society grappling with its own contradictions. May their tales continue to inform, inspire, and remind us of the precious nature of liberty. Valet, dear viewers, until we meet again on another historical journey through the annals of time.